Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
The court cases that have come through related to trans and non-binary folks, many of them are related to inaction from the managers or leaders in that case. Sometimes they learn something about themselves as cisgender people. Why do we have expectations that somebody's gender identity needs to be aligned with how they express themselves? Not all conflicts are created equal, especially when gender identity enters the chat. In this episode, we unpack the tricky terrain of workplace conflict involving trans and non-binary people, where what gets brushed off as, quote, a difference of opinion can actually be a matter of safety and dignity. Why do managers so often default to cisgender comfort, and how can we do better? We share real-world strategies from Transfocus work with HR and managers. If you've ever felt stuck between inclusion and inaction, this episode is your guide to stepping up with clarity and care. And I'm joined by my colleague, Elle, to talk about this really important topic. How are you doing today, Elle?
I'm doing great, Kai. How are you doing?
Oh, fantastic. I'm doing well also.
Well, I wanted to start, Kai, with something you just said, which is that sometimes issues around gender diversity can be dismissed as a sort of difference of opinion. And I was wondering if you could start by going into that, because I imagine that probably comes up quite a lot.
Indeed. Yeah. So most managers are going to be cisgender. That is, they're not trans. And so when faced with issues related to being trans and non-binary, perhaps they haven't had any education or maybe very little, and so are just not very familiar with the challenges that trans and non-binary folks face and what the nature of those challenges are, how often they happen as well. And so it's likely that they're going to focus more and relate more to what the cisgender person in this situation is doing or thinking or saying. So they might be like, well, this is really just has nothing to do with me as a manager. I don't need to intervene. This is for them to sort out amongst themselves. If we say talking about pronouns, a trans or non-binary person has shared their pronouns and this other cisgender person is not respecting those, the cisgender manager may kind of say, yeah, I don't get that. The singular use of they, them. Maybe they think it's grammatically incorrect and are kind of almost siding with the cisgender person, or perhaps understand why the cisgender person is uncomfortable. And so they won't come to the support and aid of the trans and non-binary person, usually not maliciously, just because they don't understand that this is actually a big deal. And in some cases, they don't know what the law is and that they do need to intervene, especially in instances of discrimination, and don't understand the gravity of the situation and that their support is needed. And so that's kind of some of the texture or dynamics that can happen. Obviously, not all cisgender managers do this. Some are dialed and understand, whether through education or just intuitively understand that they need to come and help trans and non-binary folks. But it's sometimes a fairly large percentage of cisgender managers that don't know.
You said just then about how often, if the manager is cis, they will just inevitably have a better understanding of where the other cisgender person is coming from. And so I guess I wanted to ask you about why it's important to not just look at this as a difference of opinion, and why it's important to actually acknowledge it for something actually quite serious, and that even if you don't fully understand what the trans person is saying, like why your role as a manager is really important to kind of look at this and deal with it, not just kind of leaving it to sort of sort out amongst yourselves.
Yeah. Typically, when a cisgender staff member is struggling, they don't fully know or understand the issues and will largely stay in that place, or it can get worse. Typically, things can escalate if unaddressed. And that's, of course, any issue, really. But
Yeah, of
certainly
course.
on this one, it can escalate without managerial intervention. And the court cases that have come through related to trans and non binary folks, many of them are related to inaction from
Mm.
the managers or leaders in that case. And it really is incumbent upon them to take that action because even if they don't understand everything, like you were mentioning, there is still reinforcing or reiterating of values, right? So
Mhm.
most organizations have some sort of value of inclusion, at the very least, respect and caring. Depends on the words used, but you can reiterate those to say this is how we show respect is by everybody gets their pronoun used properly in the workplace or their first name, or we don't leave them out of important decisions or meetings just because they're trans and mistreating them in some way, or we show inclusion by supporting folks to access the washrooms that align with their gender identity, right? And it's also supported by the law. So, both values and having a better understanding of the legal landscape and what kinds of decisions have been handed down to know what the role of the leader is really important so that people can step in. And again, you don't have to have all the answers necessarily, but
Mhm.
more to say, hey, we can solve this together. Let's take steps together, especially with the trans and non binary person. They might have some ideas of what they want to happen
Mhm.
and need the leader input or steps to help make that possible. Other times, the trans or non binary person does want to handle it on their own, in which case, the manager or leader can be in the background waiting in case there is something else to do. But more often than not, there is something for the manager or leader to do. And you don't have to have it fully figured out. You don't have to necessarily even fully understand why it's important to the trans and non binary person. But more, the important thing is the action in tandem with the trans or non binary person.
That's so interesting that the thing that comes up in those court cases is inaction as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
malicious action or deliberate action. I feel like that's really interesting because I would imagine, and I certainly thought it was discrimination based on people actively being unkind or cruel, where
Mm-hmm.
actually it's just a lack of action. That's so interesting. And with that, I wanted to kind of ask about like what actually happens when a manager. You used a phrase at the beginning, when they prioritize cis comfort kind of over trans safety, and I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to know about how that shapes the outcomes of conflict like this.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of builds a permission structure for cisgender people to continue to act and speak in the ways that they do that continue the harm that trans and
Hmm.
non-binary folks face, and it makes it okay to
Hmm.
cause that harm, whether that's something that the cis manager intended or not. It just becomes a part of the culture that some
Hmm.
people will be left out, or their access to things will be barred, or some complexity in the workplace
Hmm.
that really makes it difficult for trans and non-binary folks to do their best, to be productive, to be able to concentrate on work, and to show up, especially in a team. Obviously, trans and non-binary folks want to contribute. We're
Hmm.
like any other human being, but if there's complexities, it just makes it that much more difficult. And really, it can escalate to where it puts the trans person in a position of having to choose, do I stay here or do I have to look for another job? Like it can escalate
Hmm.
to that degree of difficulty. And of course, it's very difficult to find a job. Like it's a huge effort to go out back
Hmm.
into the job market and secure something where the same might repeat itself and often
Hmm.
does. And so, to the degree that cis managers can be aware of the issues, take them seriously, and take tangible steps to resolving, it can really improve things, not just for the trans and non binary person, but actually for the cisgender person as well, because they just maybe are not aware,
Hmm.
and might learn something about how to respect trans person, not just in the workplace, but out in society at large. And so it can have this positive ripple effect. Or sometimes they learn something about themselves as cisgender
Mhm.
people. Why do we have expectations that somebody's gender identity needs to be aligned with how they express themselves? Maybe I've always wanted to do something, but I felt nervous or hesitant. And by allowing others to have, more expansive way of showing up at work, I can also have access to that as well. So there's so many benefits to stepping up to the plate or for managers to show up and improve things. And it does reinforce the culture as well.
So let's say you're in a situation at work as a manager and
Mhm.
somebody is expressing, how do I say this?
Huh.
Just there's conflict. Some conflict appears at work
Mhm.
with regards to a cisgender person and a transgender person. I would imagine, and you'd know this better than me, that a lot of managers really don't know what to do.
Mm.
Once this has happened, it can be a bit nerve-wracking, perhaps because
Mhm.
they have that feeling that they don't know enough themselves about it, or they're really unsure of what to do. What steps can a manager take, and
Mhm.
also what are options that a manager can bring in to the picture to kind of handle it?
Yeah. Yeah. And so well said about, how managers can feel their own anxiety or, not confident enough to step into these types of situations. But there are real tangible steps. And I also appreciate, especially if there's perhaps not a lot of guidance from
Mhm.
me or the organization from a policy or procedural standpoint, can kind of leave managers, you know, in this limbo land where they're trying to like, kind of sort it out themselves. So it's not an easy task. So I want to acknowledge that. That said, there are some pretty simple steps. The first one of which is, depending on who's raising the issue, is to have a conversation with the trans or non binary person, understand exactly what's happening. So, asking questions, not in an interrogation style, but just more like, tell me more. You can come with your own ideas too to say, I'm happy to do these three things. Do any of those resonate? Sometimes it's about the manager or leader taking charge of the situation. Other times it's about hanging back. It really depends on what comes of that conversation. But really slowing things down, I think oftentimes leaders are very action oriented. I understand, right? You want to nip this in the bud right away, shut her down. But as much as you can kind of slow things down, not to say you don't take any action ever, but just more to really understand what's happening here, what they've encountered, how often it's happened, when it happens, how it, all the different types of questions you can ask, and to know what the person needs and wants is helpful, because that step in of itself is a watershed, because more often than not, trans and non-binary folks get dismissed. We know this from the research that we do. It's just like, this is not a thing. Sorry you feel this way, that kind of vibe. So even by taking time and listening is a game changer, right?
Right.
I
Yeah,
think
for sure.
people kind of discount that, but it's big. And then taking the actions that are needed. There's options available, right? Usually having a direct conversation, a private conversation with a person that's being misstepping, whether intentionally or accidentally, and having a conversation, a frank one. It's not a matter of like, this person is the worst person ever vibes, but more like, hey, these are the values that our organization lives by. We see that this situation is happening, which is off of what we're trying to achieve here. We want to help you with this. There's a few different options available, and then outlining what those options are, and then seeing, what their side of the story is as well, to
Mm.
see what else might be gleaned from it. Some options available are that those two employees take time apart from one another, different
Right.
shift, different location. Of course, that's not a long term solution, but it just gives each side a breather from what might be happening, and it avoids escalation, because things can escalate if unaddressed or if they persist. There are options available. Sometimes people cite either religious differences or, some sort of other protected grounds. Of course, we're organizations are not asking people to change their religious beliefs, but
Mhm.
there are different ways of approaching. So usually people have an okay time with somebody's new first name or a different first name, but they are a bit challenged on the pronoun side, in which case there is the option of not saying any pronouns, right?
Mm.
Not they, them. If somebody has said my name pronouns are she, her, you can't go to the they, them. That's not an alternative. They, them
Mhm.
is used if we don't know somebody and we're up like a placeholder. That's fine. But once we know somebody's pronoun, we need to use it. Or there's the option of not using any pronoun and just somebody's
Mhm.
first name. So just sketching those things out can help folks be like, okay, I'm not comfortable using that some person's pronoun, but I'll do the no pronoun approach, which takes
Mhm.
practice. It's not
Mhm.
very, we're
Yeah.
very used to going to pronouns, but in any case, yeah, those are a few things that come to mind in terms of steps to address the matter. Obviously, once you've addressed something, it is important to check in a few
Mhm.
times afterwards as well to see how things are going, to see if anything else needs to be done. But those are so some concrete steps that folks can take.
Mhm. So, when should education come into the
Mm,
picture? What kind of education makes difference? And if we're coming from a place of assuming that most people are relatively new to the idea of gender
mm,
diversity to this extent, what place does education have
mm.
in what?
Yeah, it's super important because if people have no context for gender diversity, it is often difficult for them to pay attention and to take seriously the things that are being asked of them or the need for respect of trans and non
Mm.
binary folks. So even, some of the language can help for people to know trans man versus non-binary versus, there's like these terminology that create anxiety for folks. And once they know that you don't have to know somebody's gender to respectfully interact with them, just taking off some of those things that are kind of lingering in people's minds, and also how to go about in navigating pronouns and how to respect somebody and what to do, what not to do, that kind of thing, and just setting that stage for them to be able to step up to the plate. That can be hugely helpful so that either you prevent the things from happening altogether if you've started with that, or you address some of the missteps that are happening either once in a while or on a frequent basis and help people shift and pivot away from those. So, yeah, education can be a huge thing that can help with that and definitely can help managers as well so that they know kind of what to reinforce and
Mhm.
to reiterate for folks in case they need some reminders, which some people do, right? It's something new. So maybe need to reiterate. So yeah, those are some of the values of education. It also helps take off some of that heavy lifting that often managers have to do. If you're educating people one by one, that's a lot versus, okay, let's get
Mhm.
everybody together, one education session, same messages, and then just reiterating.
Mhm. And I guess to close up here, I wanted to just ask about situations that Transfocus in particular have supported HR and
Mm,
managers through, and the things that have been really powerful, and also just like what you have taken from those situations as well. Like I'm
mm,
curious to know from the other side as well about
yeah.
what that's looked like.
Yeah, there's been many instances where we've been called in when things have gone off the rails, with involving
Hmm.
a trans or non binary person who is either being discriminated against or has a really difficult time at work, given some of the ignorance. It usually happens in the wake of somebody coming out at work,
Mm.
especially if there's not a lot of clear guidelines. Um, People don't know what to do or how to act. Maybe there's been education, maybe there hasn't.
Hmm.
Especially if there hasn't, it's a free fall for many,
Yeah.
and other leaders don't know how to show up either. And so it's really helping kind of refocus on what's important, and that using somebody's name and pronouns, giving them access to washrooms, all of that is critical to be able to be effective at work and inclusive and welcoming. And once that's established and the importance of that, then people are able to turn the corner. We found really effective is looking oftentimes kind of beneath the surface, there are stressful thoughts that are kind of in the way, and
Mm.
they're not readily visible. But those are often where people are stuck rather than the behaviors on top of those stressful thoughts, if that makes sense. And so we
Mhm.
kind of have a hard time addressing the behaviors if we don't first name and work with those underlying stressful thoughts. So we've found a few scenarios in which we do some exercises around those stressful thoughts with individuals, especially individual leaders, that help them kind of unpack those to help them be the most effective leader in that situation. And they didn't realize those things were at play for them. My mistakes will hurt trans people. There's, the trans person should tell us what to say or do. Like they're looking
Mm.
for guidance and instruction from
Right.
when that person's just trying to exist and
Right.
find their way. Like it's a lot to put on one person to, instruct
Mhm.
managers, right? So just helping them unpack that they have access to that already, not through that employee. And there's various other beliefs as well, or stressful thoughts at play. And so just unpacking those, it can be really interesting and powerful. And we also do that with the trans and non-binary person as well, as a way to empower them to feel like
Mhm.
they can share. Because oftentimes trans and non-binary folks are very hesitant to raise any issues. They don't want to rock the boat. There's power imbalances. They worry about keeping their job, and so they're
Mhm.
quiet as a church mouse. When really the issues, it's helpful to have the issues highlighted. So just helping empower them in that situation can be really powerful.
Amazing. Do you have any kind of final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say that there's obviously there's aversion to conflict, especially in the workplace. It can be seen as this negative thing, which there is harm being done, so obviously you want to address it, but that there's life beyond conflict.
Mhm.
And by going through the conflict and working in a meaningful, intentional way with everyone involved, it actually can lead to stronger relationships, whether that's just work relationship or perhaps more. And so it's really useful, helpful, important to go through that conflict and to address it. And that you don't need to know everything before going into it. And you can even say as much like, I'm
Mhm.
learning as I go. And that humility actually is an important part of the conflict resolution, because then it's kind of everyone coming together to step through it. And last but not least is to believe trans and non-binary folks, and even if you don't fully understand.
What a good note to end on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Kai. Where can everyone find you on social media? I'm very sporadic
Ah,
with asking you that.
yes, yes. We've got LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, etc. YouTube. This is where
Oh
some
yeah.
of the podcasts are posted as well. And yeah, we have weekly posts on all kinds of micro learning to reinforce some of what we talked about today, but other topics as well. So it's a really good source of understanding, and hope you'll join us there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kai.